Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to see a full hall on a Saturday evening. And the best part is I think all present here seem to be extremely learned and domain experts and have been functioning in this sector for a very, very long time. So I think I'm the youngest and the newest into this game of water, but I'm delighted to have with me on the panel two people who are going to be able to tell us how to get that clean water, how to look at our aquifers, how to see how we can do this resource management and resource regeneration, if it's possible to be able to address the particular issue. But before that, I would just like to sort of share with you 2-3 issues when we look at the issue of knowledge gaps and awareness. And for this, I'll just, I can see Mr. Khosla is here, who was Chief Secretary of SAM, and I'll take you to the 2 examples which I thought I needed to look at, having served a long time in that part of the area. From the time I was there in the 70s till the time about 2015, if you see in Assam, the iron content in the residual water that is available in that area is extremely high. It is terrible with tremendous amount of health hazards. So it's not that awareness wasn't there about what the problem is, but we haven't been able to resolve it. It's only actually got accentuated. So certain amount where you're looking at awareness could be the reason for not having adequate data banks, as something came out earlier. But here I think you have issues where you are aware, but you haven't been able to do enough. Why we haven't been able to do enough is the area where we need to look and question, how can we ensure that there is potable water available when there is no shortage of water in that particular area. The second issue came up is when I was looking after Kaziranga and that security issue. I used to get extremely agitated every year when you have these floods that come in and you found water erosion, you found the whole process of displacement of people. I mean, just the disharmony that it created in the environment on all fronts. But then I realized later, when you looked at it and when I discussed with some of the people, that there is a requirement of the overflowing of the Brahmaputra every year so that the flora and fauna in all these natural reserves that are there have to be, revegetated to be able to do well. The flora fauna demanded that there has to be an inflow of fresh water coming in or an overflow of that water to realize. But knowing that this is there and is a requirement as far as the nature is concerned and for protection of the habitat there, we haven't been able to identify how to stop soil erosion because you're losing land, you're losing arable space, and this is a problem which is again, I think, related to maybe implementation. Again, awareness is not the problem that is there, but again, a matter of implementation. When I looked at 2 or 3 issues that came out, which was very interesting, I think Mr. Khanna raised up some issues which I think relate to us, that enabling of legal provisions not being there. I think correctly said, the state-centered discord that happens, somebody sets the policy, somebody puts the regulatory mechanism, somebody does the implementation. You've had these various Kaveri boards and various boards to look at interstate relationship, but have you been able to implement it? I really don't know. The integrated river basin concept with 13 new river basin kind of organizations coming up, how are they going to work in harmony? Will these new policy changes create disharmony or harmony in the execution possibility? I really don't know. But I think where I've come to the firm conclusion is, I think responsibility and accountability has to be fixed. Somewhere it came out that the people who are responsible to ensure, whether they're in the government, whether they're in policy-making bodies or in the implementation or the regulatory authorities, I think they have to be accountable if things don't happen. Until you don't have accountability linked to the responsibility, you will find that things will keep going adrift. And I think whatever be the scope, that's an area where I would request to look at. And the last example I'd share just with the islands of peace when we talk about. See, in CT environment, in the army, we have this great thing. Somebody raised the issue of why aren't we saying these scalable models. There are good stories that have happened, but I think what we've done in the way when we look at military operations, every time that you have an area which gets sanitized and becomes peaceful, I think we try to increase that island of peace and the diameter of that peace. I think that is what has not happened with the good stories. If you've had a good district which has done well, maybe has it been transmitted and been copied by the next district? Is the incentive right? Is the capability existing? I really don't know. I've seen this happening in the area of education today. In Rajasthan, tablets came into these schools done by some of these, I would say, philanthropic organizations. And the more the tablets got utilized, we've just seen this arc of schools, government schools, getting bigger and bigger, or getting more responsive and more accountable. And maybe that kind of a legislative change in the thinking here would make a difference. Well, there's a lot that I could have said about with my own personal thing, but we'll take it ahead. May I first request Professor Gosain, please share with us his views on issues which are related to the subject that we are looking at today. And thereafter, then I'm going to request Dr. Kulkarni's.
Thank you much, and a very good afternoon to this august audience. I'll just like to share some of the thoughts in line with what we are discussing today. I think ultimately the water security is the final theme which we have to be all concerned about. And when we talk of water security, people have different perception of the water security. Most of the time we talk in terms of the water security for humans. That is not the true water security, as Dr. Khosla also pointed out, that we have other demands. They have to be also looked after. So the water security for environmental requirements has to be seen along with the total water security, whether we talk of agriculture, domestic, industrial, or other water uses for human requirement. If we try to look at India in the context of the global water availability, I think you can see that India is still not that ill off in comparison to many other countries. We still have in the range of around, most of the places there's a lot of variability over India, but still we can say that we have around 1,000 millimeter or 800 millimeter all over the country as the natural precipitation, which is not a small quantity. And many of our demands can be met very judiciously. If they are met judiciously, they can take care of the requirements, and we can talk of sustainability in that sense. I also want to dwell on some of the issues, the way we have been doing the water resources development. Now, I think that is where there's no doubt that water resources development is a requirement as the society started developing, on account of the fact that this resource is having the spatial and temporal variability. You cannot say that for sure every year you'll have this much amount of water available at every location. It's not possible. So in order to cater to that natural variability, the society started looking at the various options, how they can bring some water under their control, and started looking at the developmental projects, whether it's in the form of diverting the rivers into canal systems, or whether it's in the form of having the big dams where they can store water and use whenever they want to. But one thing they totally forgot to look at, that every development has an implication. But that is something which we have forgotten. And on account of the climate change impacts, which is an additional factor, this variability which was within some range is going to get enhanced. You're going to have more extreme drought conditions, you have to have more extreme flood conditions, and the complexity of this water security is really much more in comparison to what we have now, is going to be much worse. As I mentioned, that every implementation or every development, big or small, it has an implication. We are not looking back in the form of policies. When we make a policy, we said that, okay, let's do the watershed management. We went overboard. We didn't even realize that what is the implication of having in a river system thousands of check dams. Because after all, we are not generating water. We are basically moving water, and most of the time upstream. So this movement of water had the implication on the downstream projects, which were already using the water. Now their catchment started reducing, and if we look around in the country, there are many big projects, old projects, which are not getting the desired water which they were designed for because of the overdoing of the watershed management implementation, especially in the form of check dams and rainwater harvesting. So basically the trade-offs are important to be known. And moreover, different programs are run by different departments, and they are targeting the same resource, common resource. They don't even talk to each other. They are in silos. All of us know that. There's another reason. The other issues which I can highlight is that many programs which are parallel programs targeting the same resource, that is one, but we never even try to analyze what is the trade-off between the competing demands. We haven't even never tried to put together all the demands and see whether that much water is available in this area or not. So I think that is what is happening as of now. Everybody looks at the papers, and every year the Central Groundwater Board declares few more blocks which have gone from bad to worse, and that is basically reflecting the same situation that in every basin our demands are much higher than the availability, and what our deficit is there we are taking from the groundwater, and the groundwater is getting overexploited, and that is not a sustainable option. So the sustainability is the issue which has to be looked at, and that's where you have to use the science. There's no other mechanism to really understand what is the variation, what is the situation in terms of demand and supply. You have to, anything you want to manage better, you have to have control on the numbers. You have to generate numbers, you have to generate information, and only then you can act on it. So from that aspect, when we talk of having a knowledge about what we are having available and what is our demands, the integrated water resources management was a procedure which was put together and recommended by the scientists long ago, and we always keep on claiming that we have been doing that, but in reality we are not actually doing that. We are not even knowing what is happening at the basin level or at the sub-basin level or at any natural boundary. The watershed was a natural boundary which was decided to take up as a unit so that we can know how much is coming into that natural boundary, what falls as rainfall, and how much is the boundary, the area, bounded area, which contributes to any location on the river or a stream, and you can quantify how much is the flow which is expected or which is observed, and then try to see that what happened to the remaining rainfall, how much of that went into the ground as recharge, how much of that has been used by the biomass production. All those things are part of the water balance. So when we say watershed, the water balance is something which is very closely associated with the watershed, and that is the reason that we have been recommending the watershed approach to be used. This is a depiction of the watershed. Most of the time, the watersheds can be natural, but majority of them, where the populations are, they have not remained natural. You have imposed, where the natural watershed will give you a hydrology which is the natural process of what is the fate of the rainfall when it happens on that area, and how it gets distributed or reallocated. When you intervene as mankind, then you keep on taking many actions, and even putting the irrigation as in a particular area as an artificial amount of water back into the system changes the local hydrology. So that is exactly where we need to understand what is the present situation in each watershed or in each basin, and try to solve this issue of what is the water balance of that particular basin. So the requirement is for the basic, the better management, you need to start looking into development of the basin management plans, which has to be for each basin, where you can identify what is the resource availability, temporal as well as spatial, because if it's a big basin, there is a spatial variability which is quite obvious. What is the present and future demands? what are the present efficiencies of the projects, how you are using the water, what is the environmental status. These are the questions you have to first resolve and answer these questions and get the facts and figures in place, and development pathways with and without climate change. This can only be done with a very detailed observation network. If you want to manage the water properly, if you want to legislate the water, which is very important, you have to have observations on what is the groundwater in different locations, what is the flow which is coming into a particular system, even if you have a reservoir, how much is the amount of water which is being trapped by the reservoir, how you are going to use it. That is the system which is part of the dynamism of any natural system, which is not only natural, but also on that the man-made interventions are there. So the information formulation and sharing of that information with all the stakeholders is the only key which you have to really take care of. And for that, we have scientifically, there are things which are available. There are models of various kinds which are available, which can help you in deciphering this as per as your own landmass is concerned. You have the range of models, hydrological models, hydraulic models. All these models are meant for different assessment of different aspects of the same basin, whether it's environmental issues, groundwater, or the system, how you're using the water, that also can be tackled. If you look at the present situation, we don't have the capacity in the local departments who can handle these scientific tools very well. This is a ground reality, whether it's the Sand Water Commission, they are now getting there, but still there's a lot to be desired. If you look at even the municipalities who are tackling the stormwater or the sewerage network or the water distribution system, don't have the capacity. So there is a huge amount of capacity building which is required. I won't basically, because I don't know how much more time I have. I have around 5 more minutes? Okay. So we have been doing this. I was also leading the group who was looking at the water resource management of the Ganga River Basin Management Plan, where we showcase through the scientific knowledge what is the availability of water in Ganga, how, and we simulate all the natural processes, and these are the depictions of 4 elements: the land use, the soil, the terrain, and on top of that you impose the weather conditions, and then you get a lot of information on a daily basis, because all this is done on a daily basis of what is the rainfall, and all that natural processes are simulated, and you get a huge information which you can keep on utilizing. But what we found, that when we look at the interaction between the surface water and the groundwater in the case of Ganga, there are many stretches in Ganga which naturally earlier, when the groundwater table was at a reasonable level, whatever it can maintain in a natural process, many places, many stretches are losing water to the groundwater because the groundwater table has gone so much low. So we could quantify that how much is the water loss from the river into the groundwater, and that even if you release the environmental flow from the diversion points, it may not be doing the justice, or it may not do the required desired effect if you are not controlling the groundwater. So groundwater management is a huge task which has to be taken care of. We also have done a lot of work on the climate change implications on the water resources of the country, and the NATCOM 1 and NATCOM 2, what went to the UN as a report, the work was done by our group, where we quantified what is the implication of the climate change using various scenarios at that time available, and looked at what is the implication in terms of the magnitude of and frequency of the peaks in different areas, what will happen to the droughts, whether they'll become more severe, change in the flow patterns, change in the groundwater recharge. All that is depicted here in the slides which you have been given. I think you can have a look at that in the, because the paucity of the time, I'm not, but the situation is that the trends are very, very alarming. The number of rainy days are reducing. So immediately you can say that 60% of your rain-fed agriculture may not survive because the gap between the two rains during the monsoon might become more than what it can sustain. The water which is there in the soil, it may not be able to sustain to the crop growth. And moreover, the temperatures will be higher. So the implication is that you need to have some alternative sources. Whenever the rain is not coming, whenever there is a situation, you might have to provide artificial irrigation. There's a huge implication to the country. The floods are going to be much more than what they are, and the erosion is obviously when the intensity of the rainfall is higher. We have shown that how these things will change from place to place, and these are the situations in comparison to the present situation. How by the mid-century or the end century, the implications are going to be different in different areas. So the major actions which are required to use the hydrological tools for the planning, map all the interventions, that is the investments which we have to make. Somebody was mentioning about the investments which are very, very crucial. Assess the availability of water resources, total demands which we are imposing. If the demand is higher, is not sustainable, so we have no other option but to do the demand management. That is a key message which has to be taken very well. And the options for the climate changes will come later. I think we are still having some time. Our present priority should be to look after the present situation. One of the recent things which I just wanted to take another couple of minutes to show that we are not only saying these things, we are also trying to take some of the actions wherever possible. For example, this is something which we have done along with the India Meteorological Department, where every day we are getting the data of the whole country, 7-day ahead precipitation forecast of the IMD. And this we have put in a kind of website, which you can take if you want. This I'm going to leave it here, where we are running the models every day and trying to find out at different locations what is going to be the floods in different locations in the country. Right now there is no flooding, but still the model is running. It is giving you many other products which are may not be flood, but still if there is a place where rainfall is quite excessive. So I have just chosen Mahanadi as a basin. I think is taking more time because is loading the thing. So any system you can pick up, it'll give you what will be because 7-day ahead we know from the IMD at 9-kilometer grid, what is the rainfall which is going to come. We have used that rainfall to produce the runoff at the appropriate locations. And you can pick up which variable you want to see. So for example, this is a stream flow. The Central Water Commission recognizes the Mahanadi as 2 sub-basins. So if I take this sub-basin, I'm giving this available information that this is the rainfall in the next 7 days and what will be the corresponding flow at a location which is halfway through the Mahanadi basin. If I take the other parameters, I can also see what is the water yield in different areas, what is the evapotranspiration in different parts of the Mahanadi, what is the soil moisture, how the soil moisture changing with the rainfall from day to day. Now this can be a very good option for the advisories to the farmers. I think the core issue is that we need to, let me come out of this, we need to basically empower the masses with the information basis. I feel that even if you want to do the legislation, if you want to make rules and regulations, how you will implement the rules and regulations if you don't have the backup of the scientific information, and then along with that, For example, if you know that this is the area which is having more abstraction of the groundwater, you have to know that what is the level which is the permissible level. Beyond that, no more abstraction is allowed. But then you cannot say that unless you give the farmer an alternative to be used. Now that is where the management of these systems have to be done in a very scientific way, where you should know that what is the overall quantity which is available. First of all, how much is the demand? If I want to reduce the demand of the agriculture, I know that present efficiency is around 30%. I can easily take that efficiency with the investments to around 55 or 60%. So I have already reduced the demand of the agriculture sector by half. We know that, all of us know that. But the question is that how do we implement that? I think these are the issues where whether it's the urban setting or whether it's the rural setting, we have to, urban is only a small parcel in the whole basin. So we have to, and their demand is also around 10%. So I think we should lay more focus on those demands which are more inefficient, and we can set our priorities. But everything can be taken up simultaneously. And these kind of scientific bases we have already have in place. Is a question of having the national intent, and it can be translated into action. Thank you much.
Thank you very much. I think the good point that has come up is that yes, there are scientific modeling methodologies, you've got the data capability, generation capability, but I think the final problem comes down when I see as a user that if we get all these data available with us, how is the policy maker and the policy implementation going to happen finally? Because at the end of the day, if from what I read from statistics which were given, which were there in the opening, if you're going to get some 4,000 cubic kilometers of water and you only get about 1,100 and you save 633 out of that, there must be somewhere down the line we need to find methodologies scientifically and technologically to ensure that there is better resonance as far as saving and harnessing these surface water resources are there. So I mean, maybe that's where we require greater deliberation from the scientific body. Well, there's a lot more that we'll come to, but sir, over to you. Look forward to hearing from you.
You want to, can you hold on, let him finish and then we will discuss.
I have a suggestion, why don't we all share the presentations?
Is there already?
It's there in that folder.
In the
We've got the presentation in the folder.
I'll probably take maybe 12 minutes and maybe begin with, let me see if this video plays. Begin with a video which I believe is one of the most pristine springs that you find in the country. This is at 3,500 to 4,000 meters above sea level in the state of Sikkim. And it in many ways represents how traditionally we've looked at water. So going forward, I'll try and talk a little bit about identifying gaps and what kind of what kind of a response can be built around the whole question of groundwater. To begin with, I think the major gaps in both in policy and practice, challenges in practice, revolve around one is acknowledging the fact that we are increasingly a groundwater dependent country. The second one is about the dynamics of aquifers, data, and policy decisions. And I don't think they talk to each other very much. The third, as I think the previous two speakers have said time and again, that we have always looked at broad sweeping big ticket solutions, which remain popular but are not concomitant with the socio-ecological diversity of groundwater systems in India. Fourth, much of our responses are still dominated by supply side measures and have always underplayed the understanding of aquifer dynamics and the need to manage demand for water. The fourth is really a gap in knowledge, which looks at, I mean, I'm looking at it from the point of view of education, and I think much of our curricula today are still embedded in a development supply side scenario rather than a managing demand of water scenario. Sixth, the surface water groundwater interaction popularly is perceived only through the recharge lens and seldom through the missing element of base flows and efflows in rivers. And last but not least, and I think this is something we must deliberate upon a lot, that policy all these years has seldom provided any scope for collaborative efforts between the users of groundwater, academia, civil society, and government. I have hardly seen any projects where 2 ministries or 3 ministries are collaborating on a single project on water. And we're looking at a much, much larger, wider set of institutions. Okay, let me quickly show you a few slides, and I'm going to rush through them. Each one has a message. So India became the largest user of groundwater in the world in the 1980s, mind you, and India's trajectory of groundwater was very different from all other parts of the world. What it also means that today 25% of the global extraction of groundwater happens in India. Now, the question therefore is, how were we looking at groundwater in the 1980s and how are we looking at it now when our trajectory is kind of still growing and growing? The second point is about the often unfathomed groundwater dependencies. We are a huge groundwater dependent society, and forget the left-hand side statistics. I'd like you to guess what the right-hand side picture is about. Any quick guesses? I'll click on it. It's a well constructed in the Tiger Reserve of Central India. So we have now wells, even inside forests, for the so-called wildlife and support that we actually look at as an ecosystem service. A huge amount of Indians use groundwater every day. So that's the statistics. But I think increasingly many rain-fed areas in India also have a strong groundwater footprint. Now, why is India so very different from other countries? And I like this slide very much because India is a country where the atomization of groundwater use has happened in the last 30, 40 years. If you look at India's land holdings, the average land holding in India is 1.15, which means there are something like 4,000 farmers per land holding in Australia. There are nearly 200 farmers per land holding in the US, and there are 20 farmers per land holding, 20 Indian farmers per land holding in Europe. And I think that's one of the reasons why we must look at solutions within, rather than look at solutions from what's happening in the developed world, because our challenges are different. The other factor is we've never really looked very closely at energy and groundwater. And one of the reasons I say this is that energy for groundwater has come through a rapid transition of mechanical Rehet-based systems, animal-powered systems through diesel to electric pumps. And this transition has happened over a course of 20 to 25 years. The other element is, and I'm actually going to stop at this point, is when you look at a depleting aquifer. A depleting aquifer is not just about, it's not coming here. Anyway, I'll keep talking. A depleting aquifer is not just about depletion in water levels. A depleting aquifer is about changes in the agrarian economy and the hit the economy takes when an aquifer depletes. The second is the changes in the the social context of water, because 98% of rural water supply in India is sourced from groundwater. So when an aquifer depletes, the entire social security around groundwater, the drinking water security, is completely endangered. Then we have the dimension of energy, like I said before. So when an aquifer depletes, you actually use a larger amount of energy to use the same unit of water. And we really, I look at it still as a linear progression, but it's completely different from, unless we have studies on this. Then there's the groundwater quality issue. And then, of course, there's the question of base flows. As an aquifer depletes, the base flows deplete, the base flow contribution to rivers and streams deplete. And this is where we believe we have to be very careful, because then when we look at an aquifer as an entity or as a system, we are also looking at 3 major dimensions in India in terms of water security. The question of what do we mean by efficiencies, Do we actually stop at an efficiency defined by crop per drop? Or do we need to bring the crop per drop efficiency into the context of what the aquifer can provide? The second is the question of equity in terms of what happens to equity when an aquifer depletes. And we have often seen in our field areas that in depleting aquifers, the inequity rises significantly. And people who can access small volumes of water with large investment are actually able to do it at the expense of others who can't. So I'll straight away jump to my last, well, this might be interesting because this is exactly what I said before, a comparison between classical syllabi of academics or academia and what are the practitioners need on groundwater management. And there's a big difference. These are almost two dichotomies. And I think we need to bring these two together. I'll go straight to my last slide. I think, therefore, if we summarize the groundwater problem in India, it's really about understanding how much is available, what's happened to the sustainable availability of water. And availability often takes a hit, not just because an aquifer depletes, but also because there's contamination in the aquifer deteriorates in terms of quality. And when you compare that with the growing demands, increasingly, your grown demand is competing with smaller and smaller supplies of water. You run into what one could paraphrase as a multitude of competitions around water. And especially groundwater, this is where it's very vivid because groundwater is a resource that is largely unseen. So people tend to compete with each other on the subject of groundwater before conflict actually emerges. As against surface water, where conflict is obvious, where you have a known quantity of water before you, and people can contest around that quantity, groundwater is invisible, and therefore competition manifests itself in many, many ways. So with that background, I'd like to sort of conclude and then go back one slide and show you what is water security in rural India. So in order to bridge those gaps, I think what we need is a new paradigm on groundwater, especially on groundwater management and governance. A paradigm which recognizes aquifers as natural hydrogeological units. We recognize in surface water, we recognize river basins, we recognize watersheds as natural hydrological units. But we've never accorded a place to aquifers as the natural units in which we need to understand groundwater. The second is we need to understand and we need to acknowledge communities as a unit. I mean, all the development on water, especially groundwater, has been around the individual as a unit. I think we need to change that paradigm. And only then can we address the question of aquifers as common pool resources. I think we need to take a closer look at energy and groundwater, a much, much closer look than what we have at the moment. Fourth, the question of legislation and regulation is a sticky one. But one of the ideas that a lot of us are discussing is, can we actually bring about a legislation or regulation which is mainly incentive-based, aquifer-based, incentive-driven, aquifer-based, community-driven, participatory groundwater management. So how can participatory, community-led groundwater management be incentivized through a legislation? Wherein you have two primary goals. The first goal is equity in access and distribution. The second is efficiency as a productivity of water use and the productivity of the aquifer. Unless we have both the numerators and denominators as productivity indices in gauging the efficiency of water, we'll still be struggling with the question of efficiency. Last but not least, two things. One is decentralize management and governance on groundwater, and also bring in stronger economic reforms in groundwater management. For instance, I mean, there was a reference to rain-fed agriculture. Wouldn't it be easier to incentivize rain-fed cropping than irrigated cropping? And maybe that's the way to go. I'm not an economist, but maybe that's an idea we should sort of look around. I'll end with a slide which looks at what is a typical demand-supply availability water balance in rural India. In a typical Indian village with 4 or 5 crops, 3 major cropping seasons. And when we convert demand to millimeters of water, because when we look at units of water measurement, we actually measure rain in 1 unit, we measure water stocks in another unit, cubic meters, and we look at demand in units like liters per capita per day. And I think when we look at availability, supply and demand, we should bring them down to a single unit. What I've done here is actually I've looked at demand in a typical Indian village with those matrix on the left-hand side and converted that demand into millimeters of water. And when we look at the demand for drinking water in a typical Indian village, it's not even 1 millimeters. Drinking water plus livestock plus human household water is not even 3 millimeters. But therefore, when you actually look at the security of 3 millimeters of water, it's very easy to say that, everywhere it rains more than 3 millimeters and we should stock that water up. But when you look at a groundwater dependent rural economy, it's all mixed. All of these units are mixed in terms of availability, and therefore to sort out the security for that 3 millimeters of water, you have to work with the remaining 300, 400, 500 millimeters of water. And I think for that to happen, I think we need to understand aquifers. So for instance, where I come from in Maharashtra, most of the basalt aquifers are capable of holding anywhere between 50 to 150 millimeters of water. Whereas the demand in most of these places is today of the order of 350 to 400 millimeters of water. And I think this is exactly what I mean when we look at quantification of water. And unless we quantify, it's going to be difficult to bridge the gap between science, participation, and governance of groundwater, especially groundwater. Thank you very much.
I think, Dr. Himanshu, thank you very much. I thought this groundwater thing was excellent. For a layman to understand this was very, very simple to see how the impact is. Thank you very much. I think we're going to have quick 3 questions or comments, and then after that we'll have to move into the next session. I'm sorry, we're going to
improve our communication and the transfer of knowledge to people on the ground in action. I think the question on even on tariffs, for example, or the charge on water. See, I believe in the subject of groundwater, and let me restrict myself to the subject of groundwater. I think groundwater has also been the lifeline of India's water supply because it has provided the means and the mechanisms for people to access water where public water was not available. So it's difficult for us to come back a whole cycle and begin to charge for water for which people have actually created the assets. Whether it's rural or urban, if you look at groundwater, groundwater is the source that usually complements a public water source. In the rural, of course, it's more direct. But coming directly to the question of subsidies, I mean, I find it a little interesting to when for instance, the question of subsidy to sugarcane growers is brought up. And I'll tell you the reason why. I don't come at it from a very activist point of view either. If you do a water balance, if you actually do a groundwater balance on sugarcane, you come up with a figure anywhere between 1,000 to 2,000 millimeters of water. If you look at the demand of urban water in India, if you look at the urban water footprint, the demand footprint in large cities in India, most of them is equivalent to sugarcane water. And therefore, I think we need to completely change the argument around what are we going to do with subsidies. I mean, one of the reasons we actually have subsidies, I mean, my argument, for example, my counter argument to subsidies on electricity is that electricity subsidy also might have begun as a consequence of the poor quality of electricity delivered to a farmer. So if you look at even 20, 30 years back, electrification, rural electrification was actually with very poor quality electricity. And if you are providing, and even today in large parts of the large areas where I work, the promised electricity, I mean, I've got a data set on one borehole for 1 month, which looks at an electricity unit allocation to that one borehole, which is, say, between 4 units of electricity to 9 units of electricity. Now, what that does is it actually gives water out from that pump over a range of 8,000 liters per hour to something like 36,000 liters per hour. Now, a farmer who's operating that borehole doesn't need 36,000 liters per hour. And 8,000 is too short for him. So I think it's a very complex issue. It needs a lot more data and dwelling. And therefore, if everything can be incentivized under the question of community-based, quantified water management, we might be able to reach where we want to without too many hiccups.
Yeah.
So can I leave it? We'll get rather late. We'll keep it for the tea for engagement after that. Otherwise, we've got Dr. Mahesh here and he's going to he has to leave early, so I can't get him waiting too long. And it'll be great to have him there. But I'll just leave with two quick stories, which I think. Baramati used to be a terrible place. Today, it's the sugarcane capital of Maharashtra. What is the spin-off? What is the impact that has had in the neighboring areas, in the groundwater conditions in that part of the world? I think it's worrying to see that. I look at Noida. I think my father-in-law moved into Noida in 85, 86. We used to get drinking water from Delhi. Every time we came in the evening, we carried it in the car. I live in Noida today. There's no dearth of water. But look at the kind of development that's happened in that area. See the Yamuna bank, how it has happened. What is the impact of this on the neighboring areas, on the overall system of water management? So I think the crux is management of water resources, its impact assessment, and how to ensure that the balance is drawn. Somewhere I think the policy maker will have to become accountable while he ensures the implementation is right. With that, I'll leave it, and thank you all for your participation. I know there were a lot of questions. We had some very, very interesting, I would say, inputs from both the learned speakers. I've learned a lot. Thank you very much. Kind of you. We'll move into the next.